Welcome everybody today to this timely panel on open access book publishing, sponsored by the Office of the Provost and the University of Rochester Libraries. My name is Mary Ann Mavrinac, and I have the privilege of being the Vice Provost and Andrew H and Janet Dayton Neilly Dean of the University of Rochester Libraries. I'll be your host for today's event. We are really pleased to have 4 panelists with us today to discuss their experience with open access book publishing. Each will speak for about 5 minutes, followed by a moderated question period, which we're leaving lots of time for everyone to ask questions. So we really welcome your questions. We ask that you insert your questions into chat, and we'll do our best to cover off most of the questions. You saw the bios from our speakers at the outset. Very briefly, I'm very pleased to thank and welcome Kimberly Davis Hoffman, who's the Director of Learning Initiatives at the River Campus Libraries, Roger Mosley, who's an Associate Professor of Music at Cornell University. Peter Potter is the Publishing Director in the University Libraries at Virginia Tech, and he's the Visiting Program Officer for the Association of Research Libraries in support of Toward an Open Access Monograph Ecosystem, TOME. Katrina Smith-Korfmacher is Professor of Environmental Medicine and Director of Community Engagement for the Environmental Health Sciences Center at the University of Rochester, and our moderator is Paul Brookes, who is a professor of anesthesiology at the UR Medical Center. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul right now, and he's going to introduce the topic, and then our presenters will begin. Thanks again for coming today.
Okay, thank you, Mary Ann. So I'd like to welcome everybody to our little discussion here. So I'm sure, as many of you know, we are at a crux point in academic publishing. There is a lot of activity in this area, both at the University of Rochester and nationwide. In particular, at our own institution, we're in the process of trying to pass an open access policy through the Faculty Senate. In addition, there are lots of things happening in the area of open access monographs and books, and that's really what our project is about today. So, you know, there's been a lot of focus in the past on this. In particular, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Mellon Foundation ran 3 rounds of consecutive funding of something called the Humanities Open Book Project, which some of you may know about. More recently, there's been a very vibrant and emerging open access monograph publishing movement. A lot of publishers, including university presses, now offer open access options for publication. And really, the thing that's driving this here is how open access and open publishing relates to our institutional values, and in particular within the last year, as a result of COVID, closed access to educational materials is a significant source of academic inequity. And you know, if we're generating this knowledge, then we ought to make it as widely open as possible as part of our academic mission. And that's really where we're driving from at the U of R. So we have a very wide panel today in terms of experience and background. Each of them has unique things to add to this discussion based on what they've done in this field. So what we're going to do now is to ask each presenter to spend 5 minutes or so introducing themselves. Some of them have slides and can share screens, some of them don't. Talk a little bit about what their experiences have been in this area. And then if you have questions as we're going along, please post them in the chat window. And we'll harvest them from the chat window and then ask them to the panel. And we'll have a long Q&A session at the end of all this. It looks like the order that I have here is that Kim Hoffman is going to go first. So take it away, Kim.
Okay, great. Sorry, couldn't unmute immediately. So let me get my PowerPoint slide up for you. Okay, can everyone see that? All right. All right, well, thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about this really exciting book project that a number of people, and you will find out soon how many people were involved in this book. It was finally published in July of 2020. So it's had almost a year, we're getting close to a year of some exposure out there in the world of open practice. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of this particular book, I just want to put it into context that this is the actual second book project that I have worked on. Both have been edited collections of chapters from many different contributors. The first book project, however, was published under a traditional publishing model. So when this particular topic came up and we wanted to gather a group to really work on open pedagogy ideas, the nature of the topic really lent itself to openly publishing the book. We wouldn't have been very genuine if we talked about open and then didn't publish it in the open. So the idea for this book really became a labor of love for many, many people involved. It was inspired by past teaching practice and teaching practice that is emerging, as well as a specific talk that happened from a key leader in the field at the University of Rochester in April 2018. So that's kind of the genesis of the idea. And then here's a little bit more about the book. First and foremost, it was a professional development project, particularly for those of us at the University of Rochester and River Campus Libraries in particular. We knew that this was an emerging area and we really wanted to learn more about open pedagogy and open educational resources. So by going through this openly published process, none of us had experience in this area. And so it really became a learning by doing project. And so we've gained so much knowledge from this practice. Next, the book is openly licensed as well. It is in itself an open educational resource, which means that anything within this book, all chapters have been also openly licensed. Anything within this book can be kind of taken down, modified for the purposes of, whatever instructor, and then put back up into a new life form. So everything in this book can be modified. One nice thing about this particular book is that we were able to enact open pedagogical practices at the University of Rochester, particularly when we got to our copy editing phase. There was a course happening, miraculously, quite honestly, in the timing. It was a course on principles and practices in copy editing. So we wanted to take this opportunity to engage 8 students in that class. The class was 8 students. To use what they were learning in the course and then apply those skills to the book. So 4 of our chapters were copy edited by the students of this course. And then finally, I don't know if you can see that because it's being blinded a little bit by what's on top of my screen, but basically the book itself became a springboard for all of its readers to think about open educational resources and open pedagogy. And a nice carrot on top of this project was that contributors to this book, they also were in it for the professional development opportunity. And so the cycle continues. Now, there were a number of partners on this particular project. So of course, University of Rochester River Campus Libraries, we were the genesis of the idea and the inspiration for the book. And then the editorial board was made up majority of library staff, in fact, for the completion of this book. We partnered with Milne Library at SUNY Geneseo because they had expertise in open publishing. And so we really were able to leverage that power. And then they had the technical expertise to use Pressbooks, as you see here, to make that book come to life online. And finally, a huge collaborator in this project was the Rebus community. They are a nonprofit in Canada who is aimed at bringing books more and more into the open publishing landscape. And so they were great guidance to us. They really took us step by step through the open publishing process. And they also provided a marketplace where we could find volunteers to contribute to the book. So if it hasn't been clear yet, this was a unique project for us in that we took every stage of publishing onto ourselves. And so unlike the earlier project I discussed, we did some of the upfront work and then the publisher did the rest of the work. We really learned through the whole process. So just as a sense of how much of a village it takes to create a book like this and the organization that it would take to bring everyone together, we had about 145 contributors in total to the book. So I'll just allow you to look through the numbers that were included in the process. And then finally, because coming back to the idea that this was a professional development effort for the University of Rochester, here are the contributors from our campus that were involved. So I'll leave it there. I'll stop share and we'll move on to the next speaker.
Okay, thanks, Kim. That was great. So next up, we have Roger Mosley. So take it away, please, Roger.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And many thanks for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be part of this important conversation. So my monograph, Keys to Play, Music as a Ludic Medium from Apollo to Nintendo, was published under the open access Luminos imprint of the University of California Press in 2017. So I'm sharing here the website for the book. Now this was my first book, and as I'm sure many of you are aware, the book is still the unit of tenure in the humanities and sort of has this sacred status, really. So the stakes were high for me personally when it came to considering how to publish the book. But the idea of the book being open access was raised early by the press, by University of California Press. And it was immediately appealing to me, in part for the reasons that Paul mentioned, questions of accessibility, of trying to ensure that work could reach a wide public. But in my case too, there was something really important about what digital media in general and open access media in particular could offer me, especially because my book was addressing digital games and music. So these are time-based media that really do pose challenges for print, for traditional monograph publication. So one of the benefits I found really inspiring from the start was to conceive the book primarily as a digital object and to think really creatively about the format. And this comes out in a couple of ways. I've got a PDF version here, which you can see. So the book is about keyboards and about games. And I was inspired to kind of cast the book really as itself a form of keyboard, which consists of 5 keys. These are the black keys you see on the title page here. And then each of the 5 big keys is split into 5 mini keys. So they're the kind of subsections for each chapter. And there's a kind of recursive structure to it, which I think this illustration tries to bring out, insofar as the last 5 keys basically recapitulate each of the first 4. And so what this was really sort of getting me to think about was a way of, I guess on the first instance, just trying to be a little bit playful. I was writing about games and play, but also about non-linearity, about how in some ways the act of performing music sort of doesn't go in a straight line. It doesn't necessarily sort of accord to the traditional format of a book. So the in particular, the EPUB version of the book, which University of California produced, really enabled me to run with that by bringing in all of these different ways, both to showcase media, but also to create links among the different keys. So it became, it was all basically hyperlinked, and you're able to navigate around the book in a much less linear and kind of more unpredictable and playful way. The other thing, as I just mentioned, the fact that the multimedia could be really tightly integrated was massively important for me, because first, it meant that I could go and make sound recordings and some video clips too of performances and integrate them into the book. And second, the fact it was an open access project actually made obtaining permissions for audiovisual materials far easier to get. This was an unexpected benefit for me, partly because when you take out the profit equation, especially when you're approaching publishers from different sectors, that for many of them simply meant, okay, it's fine, you can use it. If you're not going to be profiting from this, then we don't mind. So for instance, I could use this screen shot in the book from a Nintendo game, from New Super Mario Bros. Wii, and I mashed it up with a Mozart piano concerto for my own slightly strange reasons. So I'll just play a little bit so you can see what that looks and sounds like. Now, there's something very appealing just about being able to tap or click these audiovisual examples and have them right there. As you can see, the press also did include QR codes, which is primarily for the other formats, including the PDF and the MOBI, whereby you can scan and then get the video to play directly. But there's something, the EPUB is my favorite format from that point of view. Although I will say it was important to me that there were a range of formats, partly for accessibility reasons. And also the print on demand was kind of important, even if it is in a sort of skeuomorphic, like old media setting, there is definitely, I think, still an element for when it comes to tenure decisions, a certain constituency that wants to see a physical book, for better or for worse. The fact that UC Press gives that option, I think, is a great thing. Although for me, it does feel in some ways like a kind of legacy format, not the one that I would necessarily want to promote my work in. But the chairman did have to get permission from the deans to consider the open access book as on an equal footing with other non-open access books. This was back in 2016. Maybe things have changed a little bit, but they had to do a really careful job of explaining that the peer review process was identical, that there was no difference in terms of quality control. But I do feel that is changing and has changed. In fact, since my book came out, it was very gratifying in 2017 that both monograph prizes awarded by the American Musicological Society went to open access books in the Luminous series. Thomas Patterson won the Lockwood Prize for his book, New Instruments for New Music, and my Keys to Play won the Otto Ginkledye Prize. So looking back on it, it might have felt a little bit like a risk at the time, but I'm certainly very happy that I went open access. I think it pushed me into really thinking about aspects of the publication process that I would never have questioned. There are a couple of issues, I think, that remain. For me, the sense of what the marketing strategy was never completely clear. I felt that the publisher was, in a sense, more invested in the platform and in the move to open access than in any specific books within the series. But that, for me, was fine because it was still possible to get the book out many different ways. It's on lots of different repositories. You can actually download it illegally, which I find slightly strange, but it's out there in all kinds of places. The other thing I would just mention super quickly as a potential issue is the fact that I was lucky insofar as I did have institutional support to fund the book, because it did fall on me insofar as UC Press asked me to come up with funding, and I managed to to put some together from various sources, including a fund at Cornell, which is specifically for monograph publication. So that was very fortunate. But I would just sound a note of caution there insofar as that might be a barrier for some authors, where there's just not that sort of support. And then the question of if it's a sort of pay to play a little bit in terms of getting the book published, even though the process still retains the integrity and the quality control it had before. So that's just a slight cautionary note, but in general, I'm very happy that I've become part of the open access movement, and it's certainly something I will continue to publish in, as things move forward.
Great, thank you, Roger. That was fascinating. Okay, so next up we have Peter Potter. So go ahead.
Thanks, everybody, and glad to see you all today. Let me get this up and going. So thanks, Roger, for that intro, because actually what you said there at the end about the cost issue is exactly what Tome is all about. Very quickly, my name's Peter Potter. I am here at Virginia Tech, where I'm the Director of Publishing, but I'm also the ARL Visiting Program Officer for Tome, toward an open monograph ecosystem. Tome is the only national level effort within the world of open monograph publishing, in that it brings together three associations: the Association of American Universities, Association of Research Libraries, and the Association of the University Presses. So unlike something like Luminos, which is based at a press, this is meant to be a cross-institutional effort. So how does Tome work? As Roger was saying, he had to come up with the money. And the Tome idea is that the participating institutions step up and provide the baseline grants of $15,000. So Cornell is now a member of Tome. And so in principle, or in theory, your next book, Roger, you could apply for this and be given the full $15,000. And we work directly with Luminos, actually, on many Tome books are also Luminos. Are paid directly to publishers, and publishers agree to release an open access edition, and they're free to go ahead and release the print edition as well. And in every case, they have done that. So as of when we started in 2017, so Tome is a 5-year pilot project. It started in 2017. We had 12 participating institutions. And since then, we've added another 8. So we now have 20 participating institutions. And these are all, essentially what this means is that the provosts or the library directors or the deans, a dean at the university has agreed to fund monographs published by their faculty. We have 66 participating university presses. And what that means is these are presses that are willing to accept the grant money, the $15,000 baseline grant, in exchange for releasing the book open access. And so far, this is a little out of date, but 23 of the 66 presses have published or contracted for Tome books, and we're growing that number every day. So far, Tome has been responsible for the publication of 92 books as open access. We started, the first 10 were published in 2018, and we're on track this year to probably surpass 40 books. So we'll be well over 100 books that we've been able to see published as open access books. Here are the books, or here are the fields that are represented. You can see it's a pretty good representation of the humanities and social sciences, where book publication is still the coin of the realm. We've had, interestingly enough, a lot of the idea behind Tome was to support particularly first books by assistant professors, but we've had a lot of associate professors and full professors whose books have been published, which I think has been a good thing in that it creates a sense that we're not ghettoizing a particular assistant professor first book kind of monograph. These are being endorsed by professors at all levels. Here are the presses that the number of books published as tome books, and you can see Duke has been way ahead of this, Duke, Cornell, Minnesota, and Michigan. And what this has meant for them in terms of funding is that, so Duke, having published 25 books, they've received roughly $375,000 over the last 3 years, which is a huge benefit to their bottom line, and really helps to support the publication of monographs at these presses. A quick note on usage. We've done some analysis of the first 25 books published as tome books. And to give you a sense of how successful this has been, so this bar chart shows you the green bar here is the average total downloads for one of those 25 tome books has been over 2,500 downloads. The red bar here is what the sales have been, so 412 on average sales. So you can see just over 400 sales of print copies versus 2,500 plus downloads. That's a huge increase in accessibility. And the fear that somehow this would eat into sales of the print editions, this 445 figure, is what a book not open access in the same fields averages in terms of sales. So we've seen a slight drop off, but basically like 5%. So not significant in most cases. And just to give you a sense of kind of where these books are being accessed, all these different platforms and providers, and JSTOR is by far the best source of activity for these books. So one of the things we're trying to do with Tome is to encourage the publishers to make the open access edition available in as many forms, repositories or platforms as possible, because it increases the usage. And JSTOR is clearly the best place to go. In terms of, one of the things that's very clear about open access books is that it really does increase, the term is now engagement, as you see here from Mike Taylor at Digital Science, OA books have significantly higher use on social networks, higher coverage in the mass media and blogs, and evidence of higher rates of social impact in policy documents. And here's an example of one book that was a tome, one of those first 25, book about Chinese dance. And it has gotten significant Twitter attention in East Asia. Interdisciplinary citations, where we're tracking things like social media, and here in the bottom left, the citations. And one thing that we didn't really expect was some of the artists portrayed in this book or discussed in this book were not well known in the Western world. And since the publication of this book and the availability of it, open access, some of these dancers are getting worldwide attention in a way that they didn't before, and that's been really pleasing for the author. So the early lessons from Tome that we're taking away are that definitely open access drives engagement, As I said, the more platforms, the better. OA increases worldwide use. The number of countries that access or that we see usage of the book is 30 plus countries for most of these books, as opposed to a print edition, which might not get very far out of North America. And so far, no discernible impact on sales. So what comes next for Tome? We're looking to add funding institutions. We would love to have the University of Rochester as a participating institution. Better metrics to demonstrate impact. That data I showed to you is really difficult to get because of the nature of collecting decentralized data. We're developing best practices for promoting works, things that authors can do to help promote their books, which when it's open, when a book is open, it means the author, you can tweet the book and provide a link to the book, and people can actually just go right to it and download it if they would like. And we're working on our plan for life after the 5-year pilot. And finally, I just wanted to mention that one of the biggest problems, as I said, is this problem of metadata and collecting usage data. And there's an effort underway to address this problem by developing an ebook data trust, where all of the publishers and platforms would feed information, usage information, to a centralized place. And so we'd have ready access to this information. So that's something that's in the works. And I think that's it. I will share these slides later if anybody's interested, and I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards.
That's great, thank you. Lots of useful information coming, drinking from the fire hose here.
Yeah.
And so our final panelist is Katrina Smith-Korfmacher. And so if you'd like to say a few words, and then it looks like we're going to have lots of questions. Katrina.
Great, thank you. So my assignment is to tell you the story of my book in 5 minutes or less, which is a challenge because it took me about 5 years to write it. And it's a book that I had wanted to write for about 10 years. So it's called Bridging Silos, Collaborating for Environmental Health and Justice in Urban Communities. Came out from MIT Press in 2019 in both print and open access. So as I said, I've wanted to write this book for about 10 years. And I want to tell you very briefly why, because that ties in with the story of why the impact of being open access for me. It came out of a conversation I had with other people who, like me, run a community engagement core in environmental health, in an environmental health sciences center. And we were talking about how we all worked with communities to bring science into policymaking and practice change and problem solving in our diverse communities. And that we had similar dynamics and similar roles, but there was no way to share these experiences because they were in different geographies, had to do with different issues, varied communities, could pool and share with others. So there was no way to do that in a single paper, and no way to do that in a multidisciplinary cross-issue way. So we said, oh, we should write a book. Like, how many times do people say that? Yeah, 10 years later, nobody had written the book. So I decided I was going to. The opportunity I had was I submitted a proposal for a part-time year-long sabbatical in 2014. So I started working on it in 2015 and did most of the work on the book in that time. So I want to show you. Here's my book. It's a hardcover book. I love this book. I love the art. I love the physicality of it. I have a copy that I bring around with me, and the people who are part of the community case studies have signed it and written in it. It is a physical object that I love dearly, and I want to start there before launching into the open access story. So I had always admired books in MIT's Urban Environment series, so I knew that I wanted to go there. It was my first book, like Roger's, so I wasn't quite sure how this was going to come out. So I figured I'll just write it first. I know you're supposed to write a prospectus, get it accepted, but I just wrote the thing first and then gave it to them, and they accepted it, which was great, except they wanted me to cut it from 125,000 words to 110, which was way harder than writing those 15,000 words in the first place. So up till now, this is all a story of a normal print book, right? But my editor, after it was accepted, said sort of the flip side of what Peter just described. MIT Libraries had sort of a pilot grant program to make certain number of titles open access. And she said, with the community-facing mission of this book, I think they might like it. So she submitted, asked if it would be okay. And I said, well, I guess I could always say no, but I have some things I'd like to find out, to the MIT Press, to get one of these grants through their library to make it open access. Meanwhile, I was trying to understand, what would this mean for me? Like Roger, I was thinking about hopefully being considered for promotion within a couple of years. So I talked with my dean in the medical school and said, I'm a policy scientist. You know, this may be read by multidisciplinary social scientists, but in our world, in the medical center, I'm not sure how this would be perceived by reviewers. And in terms of promotion, he said, basically, I don't know. We'll wait and see what kind of impact it had. And I knew that for a book that was going to take several years. So that wasn't a very reassuring answer. So in the meantime, a librarian friend had said he was concerned that if it was open access, it might not make it on the list of books that libraries consider for purchase. So that could be a detriment to it. And that made me a little nervous. But meanwhile, the MIT Press said yes. So I decided yes as well, mostly because of that community focus of the book that I originally described, that it is multidisciplinary, it is applied. So the unusual marketing strategies were probably going to be tricky anyway, and having it free and open access might help overcome some of those challenges. I also realized that the royalties were going to be really small anyway, so I wasn't giving up much by even if it did have an impact on sales, and that I had planned to donate those to the community groups that contributed to the case studies anyway. And it ended up, just so I don't forget to say, that the royalties just covered some of the editing costs, after page proofs, and then the rest was donated. And I also talked with another MIT Press author who had said similar concerns and experiences, and we thought it might be really fun to write a blog or a short article together about our concerns and the experience, but we haven't quite got to that yet. So I'd also like to show you very quickly what the website looks like. Okay, so here's I also love the open access part of this. So here is the MIT Press website. You click on open access. They've changed this interface about 10 times since it was published, but you can see now you have the little mouse over and a way to get to the open access version of it. It's pretty clunky and basic. You just download different PDFs and there it is. So love this as well. And now I'm going to pivot to telling you why. So again, this is my first book, so I didn't have a basis for comparison. This whole process was free to me. Enough barriers in writing a book. There's no way I would have also been able to or undertaken raising funds if I needed to make it open access. It wasn't a really well-developed system. My sense was they were still piloting. As I said, it was sort of an add-on. And my book wasn't in the first place a real clear disciplinary fit for any of the normal marketing that the press did. So I just want to reflect very quickly on the marketing aspect. I ended up doing a lot of work. I selected the blurbs, as you probably saw from the front page, to have one from Gina McCarthy, the former head of the US EPA, to appeal to government audiences, one from Peggy Shepard, a leader of one of the most well-known environmental justice groups in the country, to appeal to community groups, and Andy Dannenberg, who's at University of Washington, to appeal to academics, figuring that would help cover the basis of my main three audiences. The press then also was able to mail physical copies out to reviewers, and it seemed like that was something that was really meaningful to them. It made them feel appreciated, and they all asked for one. I also wrote a few blog posts to try to make sure that this multi-issue book got into different sectors where people would run into it. I was less successful in getting something into the conversation or foundation-based newsletters that I thought would be related. Less successful in terms of social media because I'm not an expert there. And one of the things that I think was successful was having some webinars that also got this into different spaces. So overall, I don't know for a fact what impacts this had on the revenue, but but in terms of the sort of negative impacts, I didn't feel like I got a lot of help in terms of marketing from the press, but I don't know if that was because of the nature of my book or their organization at that moment, or that, you know, there was not any more money for the press to be had in marketing it. On the other side, it made it much easier for me to market because I didn't feel sheepish about saying, oh, buy my book. It's free. And some people still chose to buy it because they like a hard copy. For example, I gave a Zoominar for the University of Kentucky where they ordered 25 copies of them and offered them as prizes for the first 25 people to register. So that was kind of fun. So I have no idea about, you know, impacts on longevity. Obviously, it's also in print, so that probably won't have an impact. And MIT is clearly so focused on growing its open access a portfolio that I'm not concerned about that. Tracking impact has been really challenging. As Peter said, they won't tell me how many downloads there were. They just tell me that that's meaningless. And that's really frustrating to me because I'm really really curious about that. The social media whirl on it doesn't capture most of the marketing efforts that I did and I know that are out there because they are not sort of general press kinds of channels that they follow. But I have been contacted by several classes from around the country that are using part of all of it. It's great that it's free for the students. I've gotten lots of positive feedback that it is for community groups and members and people who are in government and civil servants. So the fact that it is open access is really meaningful there. I did at the end of the day get promoted. So maybe reviewers appreciated that storyline of this being a community facing book that was accessible to that intended audience. So, you know, despite some confusion along the way, I felt like this opportunity to have the book be open access was really positive for me, but particularly because of my audience and my intended impact of this book and the marketing efforts I made. And I look forward to discussing, you know, the trade-offs and other factors with you now as I hand off back to Paul.
Great, thank you, Kim. Sorry, thank you, Katrina. So yeah, I think without too much ado, let's head into our questions because I realize we're pushed for time a bit here. One of the questions that came in for Kim was, you know, you've had a lot of contributors here. I believe you said 145 contributors. How much labor is involved? Like, you know, what do you think was the cost of actually producing the book in terms of human effort and labor? All for essentially no revenue in return, right? Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yes, sure. I saw that question come in early, so I've had some time to think through. Time and labor is obviously a huge concern here. But I think for the purposes of this book, we have to maybe adjust, you know, what is our idea of incentive? What is our idea of reward? I certainly could not calculate in my head right away how much hours and time and salary would have been spent on this book. But what I will say is, at least for those of us on the editorial board, and then we've had some new of our contributors to the book, at least in the library, this was seen as professional development for us. And we've become so much stronger in the area of open practices because of this project. And so, you know, much of the work was done during working hours. So, so as far as getting paid, not getting paid, you know, we were paid for our work. And as I said, the professional development efforts have definitely paid off down the road.
Yeah. For the money, right?
Exactly. And if I could just say for the contributors outside of the library, you know, there's a real passion in this open community. And I was floored by the pace at which volunteers signed up to work on this book for us. And so if you think they each did a small chunk of this bigger project, then you don't start to think, oh my gosh, like how much work was put into this. But they all took some investment in developing their own practice or sharing their own passion in this work. And it has paid off. I know we have some new authors that emerged from this book. So, you know, they were shouting out on Twitter, like, this was my first publication. So there's a line on the CV, you know, incentive towards tenure and promotion. And then it has led to other opportunities. We've been presenting on this book, and then there's been spin-offs of the chapter authors. They've done their own work. So it really has been kind of a wealth of different opportunities that have come from this book. So if that is the incentive of the reward, then I think we've done well.
Thank you. That was great. And I want to move quickly to a question that somebody raised fairly early on. We're going to direct this toward Roger. Can you talk briefly a little bit more about the tenure process? And how did that go? What did your tenure reviewers think about this? I think you mentioned you talked with your chair. Can you provide a little bit more information on that, please?
Yeah, sure. It all ended up going quite smoothly, but I have to say I was concerned about it going in, like having made this decision. And I did feel in part it was a generational divide that had to be overcome as much as a technological one. There was, I think, in some people's minds back then, I mean, I'm talking about 2015, 2016, it's not that long ago, but it feels a long time ago. I think some of the associations with open access publication then were not easy to reconcile with the constant emphasis on excellence and kind of exclusivity that has to do with tenure. So I think there was a kind of mismatch there, and it really, I got some help from my editor at the press to really spell out exactly what the publication process entailed, and that seemed to satisfy them. I mean, it's very interesting for me listening to Kim and then thinking about how the publication process itself can be transformed by an open access kind of ethos or attitude. And I love that idea too. But I think because this was a kind of first step, it was important at that point, certainly, for the administration to see everything else as the same, except for this strange fact that it was an open access book.
Can I add something on that, Paul? One of the things one of the ideas behind Tome is that by getting the faculty members' institutions' involvement is important in the process, and it helps alleviate some of those concerns. So here at Virginia Tech, because the funding comes from the provost's office, the concern that some of the authors, some of our faculty who were initially concerned about having an open access book, and I could say to them, the funding here for the open access is coming from our provost's office. So that shows that he endorses what you're doing here. So that's an important part, I think, of
that's good for peace of mind.
Yeah,
it's a very good point. There was a question regarding copyright. It was addressed towards Roger and Katrina, so maybe we'll have Katrina answer this one. In terms of getting permissions for copyright for third-party content, but also sort of the various different options for OA licensing. Can you talk a bit about the decision-making process there? What made you choose that particular type of license?
Well, for mine, that wasn't relevant, right? Because until it was all done and I'd already gotten those permissions, essentially, it wasn't open access, and it's both.
Okay, so it was sort of a post hoc decision, I guess.
Very much so, yeah.
Right, and I guess sort of bouncing that back to Roger, how did that go? I think you mentioned a little bit about how the holders of the copyrighted material were more willing to part with it because there wasn't profit involved. That seems sort of opposite to what you would expect. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, it really did generally receptive, rights holders were to my requests, especially when they realized that. And maybe this was partly the way I was presenting it, and maybe also, to be honest, some of their lack of familiarity with some of the terms of the licenses. And what it did end up with me choosing in consultation with the press was a BYNC-ND license. So, because I think if they had realized that by giving me license to print that, it could have then been reused in any format in any other context without their permission, they might not have been so happy. So that was part of a learning process for me and for the press, and I think for them, in terms of actually understanding what the ramifications were. But in general, I was really gratified by their response when it became. I think when you take out the financial interest, which I know doesn't motivate many academic presses or even, more sort of trade scholarly presses. It just does. I don't know. I found it really. It opened up a lot of people's attitudes and minds too. So that was a very
that's
nice
really
surprise.
interesting. We have a question in the chat box here as well. I'm unsure who might be best qualified to answer this, so maybe you can all step in. Can you say what is the evidence, at least even if it's anecdotal, are these types of books more widely adopted as course textbooks? Obviously, most of yours are monographs and wouldn't perhaps typically be given as a course text. But maybe Peter has some information on this.
Yeah, I can add something there. And it is anecdotal. We don't have anything systematic, but a number of the authors that we've talked to have mentioned that their book is being used in mostly in graduate level courses, and because it's freely available, it just makes it an easier book to assign. So we published, or one of our faculty members published a book that was on French colonial history, and it was being used in a graduate level course at Berkeley. We have several more instances like that. So, and the authors tell me that they're confident the book would not have been adopted if it were, because the cloth edition was priced at $65.
Yeah. There's another question, which also I think we're going to direct to you, Peter, and it's actually related to a question that I had earlier on. Within my field, at least, a typical article publishing charge for a scientific journal is anywhere from about $1,500 to $3,000 for a scientific article. I know you mentioned $15,000 for tome. Can you say a little bit more about maybe how that number was arrived at? Certainly within the life sciences literature, we had this situation where PLOS journals set their charge at $1,500, and everybody that came along after them that's what they charge because that's what the market will bear. What is a fair charge for a book publishing charge? Do you see upward pressure or downward pressure on these numbers, on the finances as this is going to continue to grow?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so the $15,000 figure was partly the result of, we knew that the Luminos series at University of California, that was what they were charging. We knew, we checked what some of the other commercial presses like Palgrave are requiring for open access. We knew that there had been a Mellon funded study that showed that actually the typical average cost for a monograph for a university press monograph is well over $20,000. We thought that many of the provosts and people who are that were asking to fund these books would balk at that, and the provosts we talked to balked at that. So we started with a $15,000 figure as something that seemed, more in line with what people expected and what provosts were willing to fund. There's downward pressure on that, and I think we're seeing more open access publishers that are driving that price down. They're saying that they can publish a monograph with under $10,000. I think that's low, but I do think that over time this is one of the things that's going to settle out, and I think we're going to end up somewhere between like $10,000 and $15,000 as kind of an average price for a BBC.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And then one of the other things that is bubbling under there is this issue on what exactly are you getting for the money, right? I mean, some of you have mentioned having print copies. Some of you have mentioned having digital copies or digital distribution of PDFs or EPUB or Kindle or Nook or whatever particular format. How do you gauge the longevity of these types of products? Because one of the issues is, we have the Internet Archive, we have the Wayback Machine, but stuff doesn't stick around forever online, right? So do you think we will ever see the death of the physical printed object book, even when everything is freely available online? I know some of you have talked a lot with passion about the physical object. Is that I know one of you, I think, referred to it as a legacy. Is that what are your thoughts there?
That was me. I didn't mean to. I love books too. I mean, and in fact, I will say that the paper copy of my book has a special place in my heart for real. But I was surprised that I was more excited by the EPUB and to some extent by the Mobi, and they had no traction whatsoever. Everyone just grabbed the PDF. It's like, I think that there's such a strong sort of network effect there. But as I was trying to show, I think the EPUB has multimedia capabilities. I think there's so much more we could be doing with formats, especially as we move more into a multimedia and interdisciplinary kind of era, and multi-authored too. So I think but it does bring then the risk of stranding certain formats. So perhaps the PDF that strikes me as a reasonably solid one that we could probably rely on for maybe the next 5 years or something. I don't know.
I think we're all too old for you to be asking us that question.
Yeah.
We'll say the EPUB is actually, in terms of preservation, it's better than the PDF because of it. It's based on XML, and so that's easier to preserve, and it's also easier for accessibility. I think you mentioned that PDF is very hard to make accessible. The EPUB is much better, although not perfect, but it is a better option for that. And our hope is, certainly with Tome, is that funding, that $15,000, goes to support the presses doing all the different formats that they can manage. And I will say, one of the things that we've learned, you mentioned Mobi, which Mobi is now, I think, going away. Mobi was the format that Kindle uses. And one of the things we found is that when an open access book is made available as a Kindle book at $0 price, a lot of people find it there and download it. We've seen that's one of I mentioned JSTOR as being a place where a lot of usage happens. When the book is in Amazon as a free Kindle book, it gets a lot of usage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think we've had some really good questions so far. There's a lot of sort of comments coming in. One of the comments here in the chat window is regarding the use of digital note-taking. Certainly in the medical school here, every medical student gets a free iPad on day one of medical school, and they use them for their entire tenure here. And so having the ability to bring textbooks and things in and scribble notes on the pages is certainly an advantage as well. Maybe just finally we can wrap up with one more question. I guess we'll direct this toward either Katrina or Kim. A question regarding marketing. You had both mentioned the necessity of sending the physical object out to book reviewers. Apparently book reviewers are curmudgeonly and demand a physical object. Do you see that changing? Do you think there's any change in the way that open books are getting reviewed or critiqued?
In my case, I really think it was just being able to offer them something and thanks for their labor, and it made them feel special and appreciated.
Yeah,
I'm finding certainly that with our open access books here at Virginia Tech that we publish, particularly books that have an international audience, if they're going to get reviewed in international journals, the international journals are increasingly open to the idea of just reviewing the free ebook or the free open access book. You know, it used to be that journals, that was the only kind of payment that somebody got, a faculty member got for reviewing the book, was to get the physical copy. And I think that's going to stay around. But I think there's a growing acceptance that that's not always possible in every case.
Yeah, we're humans. We like our physical trinkets, right? Such as our bookshelves. All right. So I think we're sort of getting to the end of where the questions are here, and I know we were supposed to wrap up at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to hand it back over to Mary Ann now, who's going to have a few closing remarks. And before that, I want to thank all of our panelists for a really interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. That was fantastic, everyone. Thank you, Paul and Roger, Peter, Katrina, and Kim. And thank you all for coming today. I know we're losing people quite rapidly now. Please know that if you have any other questions with regard to open access, you can reach out to your subject librarian at the UR, and we'd be happy to help you both with your questions and if you're interested in publishing. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thanks again for coming today.